Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, come on, we can do better than that. Good afternoon. All right. Did everybody enjoy your lunch? I don't know about you, but when I think about a sack lunch, that's not what I typically think about when I think about a sack lunch. We're going to continue exploring our themes of networked learning and improvement science. I think we had a great morning. I really appreciate Nelson Gonzalez and Sharon Greenberg really steeping us in the theory of networked learning and improvement science and giving us some practical tools to use in our communities. And this next panel this afternoon, the first one, is really designed to give us insight into what communities are already using, how they're already applying these principles of data-driven improvement. And so I'm thrilled to welcome our panelists and our moderator to the stage. Our moderator this afternoon is Jeff Edmondson, who's the managing director of the Ballmer Group. Jeff, great to see you. And our three panelists, I'm going to go ahead and encourage them to come on up. First, Bill Crim, who's the president of the United Way of Salt Lake City and that region. Tafona Ervin, who is the executive director of Graduate Tacoma and working with grade level reading in Tacoma, Washington. And Deepti Panjabi, who has joined us from Reed Charlotte. And so I will turn it over to our moderator, Jeff, and this incredible panel. So thank you very much.
Better use that. Thank you, sir. Thanks to Ron and Ralph and the entire campaign team. It's great to have the opportunity to be here today. I just want to say that this is the cool room to be in. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. This is the place. This is where you want to be. Look, everybody's coming in now because they now realize this is where you want to be. So, how many of you were just in the session that Sharon did talking about continuous improvement methods? How many of you, raise your hands? Okay, about half. Okay, so in designing this session, I made the assumption that everybody was going to be. So my apologies in advance to those of you who were not. But for those of you who were, what we thought would make this session the most valuable would be to have the three folks up here who are amazing and who will introduce themselves in 1 second. Give you very, very concrete examples of how they are actually using some of the tools that Sharon introduced us to, maybe some others, to do essentially what this whole conference is about, of getting past looking at trend lines and outcomes, which I think everybody in this room is probably doing in some way, shape, or form, to make sure that the work that they're doing in collaborative bodies is actually leading to real impact on the ground. Right? So each of the three people up here has a concrete example of how their collaborative partners are not just looking at the outcomes, in the worst cases, maybe admiring the challenges and the problems that we face, to actually getting people to move towards real action. So we're going to do that. We have about 58 minutes and 52 seconds to make it happen. According to that clock right down there. We're going to divide this up into three sections, a very short one at the beginning where I want to ask 5 people to ask questions that are top of mind for them about moving from outcomes to impact, right? So what is on your mind about how to get your collaborative and your community, your partners, to really move towards changing their everyday behavior to achieve real results, right? So we're going to try to get 5 questions, and that will help orient the 3 panelists up here as to what's on your mind. We're then going to have each of them share some slides on the examples that they have. So where they have seen trend lines change. And then we're going to close out with some questions from you all. I'm probably going to jump right into you all rather than asking questions myself because I just want to make sure we get to dialogue. So please be jotting down your questions as we go. I just want to say that the reason I'm here, the reason that I'm moderating this panel is because the founders that I work with, Steve and Connie Ballmer, the first time they got introduced to the work that I led formally, we did a data walk where we put up on the walls all this data around trend lines that we're seeing in communities like Salt Lake, like Tacoma, and others. And then what we put underneath those trend lines was an annotated run chart. Does anybody know what that is? You win. That's good. From Charlotte. This is very good. You get 700 bonus points. Awesome. All right. So an annotated run chart is something that I hope you all will become addicted to. You're going to see a little bit of an example shortly, I know, in Bill's presentation. But it's essentially a trend line against an outcome like attendance, where you're actually able to pinpoint at the point of an intervention what happened. And not year to year or even month to month, but maybe week to week. So for example, if you're trying to improve attendance and you actually had volunteers in the schools not wait for the kids to show up, but go out into the community and help make sure kids were able and felt safe to come to school, you could see how that little intervention, that one little thing that you did, whether or not it had an impact that week, right away. And then you could decide whether you wanted to continue doing it if it had that impact. Well, the very first time that Steve and Connie came and learned about this work, we had about 40 slides that we couldn't fit on the wall of our data walk. And I was a little nervous about doing this data walk because I thought they're going to get bored, this is going to be lame to them, they're going to hate it. Well, they walked in the room, they didn't even say hi, they just started looking at the data, and then Steve is over in the corner flipping through those 40 slides, wanting to see more annotated run charts. Because what was hard for him to pinpoint in this sector was, how are interventions actually leading to outcomes? And I think if I were to summarize all the work that I did with Strive Together, and now from this new vantage point, learning about all different networks, when I'm going around to communities, it is really hard sometimes to pinpoint what interventions are actually leading to improved outcomes. Does that make sense? That is sort of the thing that I feel like we're wrestling with in getting from outcomes to impact. That's the challenge, and that's why I'm excited that the campaign is framing things in that way. So, I want to open up with 5 questions. What is on your mind about pinpointing those interventions, and then how to improve them, how to scale them, how to spread them? What is on your mind? What are 5 questions? Very quickly, you're not allowed to give a speech. You are limited to 120 characters or less in your question. And Bill is going to be the enforcer on that one. Is that good? Okay, yeah, your count. Okay, he's going to count the characters. This is great. Any questions? You would want to make sure these guys are, yes, back in the back.
Biggest internal challenge to shifting to this way of working?
Biggest internal challenge to shifting to pinpointing interventions and changing behavior. Is that right? I added on to that a little bit. Okay, I saw a hand in the back. Yep, over there. Go ahead.
How are we creating systematic access to books outside of school?
How are we creating systematic access to books? So that would be an intervention, right?
Yep.
And understanding the impact of that. Okay, got it. Good. In the corner, and just go ahead and yell it.
So how do you know the result is how do you know what you see is the result of the intervention and not something else?
How do you know if the result you're seeing is from the intervention and not something else? Okay, we're done. This panel was great. Thank you. You just had to ask that question, didn't you?
Yep.
It's a terrible one. All right, good. Go over here. Yeah.
Building on that, how do you share credit appropriately when many actors are part of facilitating the impact you're talking about?
How do you share credit appropriately? Awesome. Another awesome question. One more. 5th one. Who's going to be the lucky yes? Right here. Stand up real quick just so you can, yeah.
How do you develop and integrate this into your existing workflow?
So when you say this, what do you mean?
That is this process
Okay.
that we're talking about.
Got it. So how do you integrate this work of kind of pinpointing interventions into your existing workflow? Is that right?
Yeah.
Good? Great. Those are 5 awesome questions. I knew that awesome questions would come out of it. The good news is I think some of the examples that you're going to see get right at that. And the other good news is that Bill wrote those down.
No one went over 120 characters.
They did?
It was awesome.
That is awesome. So this is a group that we now have data that says this group follows directions, which is great. Okay. So very excited about that. Do you guys feel like you got those? So you can kind of think about them in your comments, and then we'll make sure to address them afterwards. if we haven't. So I think we're going to start with you, Deepti, and
Sure.
dive right into an example.
Okay.
And then we're going to go with Bill, and then Tafona is going to share an example and summarize a little bit, and then we'll jump back out to you all. Sound good? All right, you excited? You do not sound excited. All right, that was good. That was good. All right,
Better.
she feels better. Go. All right.
Good afternoon. I'm the data and research manager at Reed Charlotte, and over the last year, I've had the privilege of supporting the work of our data collaborative. And the data collaborative is a group of 28 leaders in 10 organizations who are using data as a tool to improve outcomes for kids. These 28 leaders receive training, coaching, and ongoing support from us for the next 3 years. They also serve kids as early as birth until 3rd grade. And in order to be a part of the collaborative, they have to use one of 3 common assessments that we've asked them to use. And our big question, so as we were thinking about planning for the work, we knew our community was very accustomed to using data for reporting or for accountability purposes because that's required and we know that's important. But we knew that we weren't maximizing the actual data with just looking at reporting only. And so our big question for this work really is how do we move beyond data as only a reporting tool to maximize the use of data? To think about how do we use the data and see what can we learn and improve using the data that we see here? How can we take action based on what we're learning? How do we communicate our results to both families and staff members? And how do we use it to motivate teams so that they're regularly checking for that progress to goal? So I want to share the example. This seems to be advancing on its own, is that right?
Yeah, that's good. It was a trick that we put in there to try to make you go fast.
Oh, okay, got it.
I don't know what's going on.
All right,
exactly.
okay.
I do need to know, though, how did you associate if you go back one slide, do
Sure.
you know how to do that? How did you associate the yellow sunglasses with communicate? Okay, I'm just kidding. I love it, though. All right, this is good. This is good. Okay,
All
just
right.
kidding. Great, here we
So
go. All right.
I want to share the example of one organization. All of the organizations we work with brought their data to life this year. One preschool was able to do this by looking at their data in the fall. So what you see here is a graph that shows the progress on key literacy skills for 4-year-olds. And the y-axis shows you those key measures that are associated with those key skills we know kids need to master before 5 to be more likely to read on grade level. The green arrows are pointing to the bright spots, and that's what we really begin with. What bright spots do you notice here? The red arrows are pointing to areas for improvement. So Charlotte Bilingual Preschool was able to take this and connect it to purpose, and here's how they did it. First, they said, okay, here's one skill we know we can focus on this year. We know this skill matters for kids in terms of their foundational development, and so we're gonna focus on picture naming, which is an expressive language skill. Then they said, let's go into classrooms and see how often teachers are using the strategy, which is commenting and labeling, connected with that picture naming skill. Turns out they weren't using it as often as they would like, and they weren't all using it to the fidelity that they would hope for. So then they said, okay, we're now gonna build a training and coaching plan based on that and coach our teachers, give them feedback, let them know how often we're seeing them use the strategy, and share where there are more opportunities to use the strategy. And then finally, they embedded their data in their regular meetings for their improvement cycles to look at the data and have student-centered data-driven dialogue. And that happened 3 times per year. So this is them celebrating progress at the end of the year with balloons and cake. They did that regularly, so yes, it happened at the end of the year, but it also happened regularly throughout the process. And now I think it's my turn to turn it over.
Well, okay, wow, that was amazingly fast. Can we give her a round of applause? Wow, that was so good. So you actually left enough time to ask a question, so I'm going to, so when you say this preschool did it,
Yes.
did the preschool do all that work themselves, or did the data collaborative do a piece of it with them, or did the intermediary org, Reed Charlotte, do some of it? Like, what were the roles of the different partners
Sure.
in getting them to this level of detail? I think to this question of how do you embed it, just curious about the roles of the different partners.
So the Data Collaborative is Reed Charlotte, so it's a program that we're executing on it in our organization. And we were there side by side with them. So they get access to technical assistance when they need it, but we help them plan those improvement cycle meetings. We also help them analyze their data. So we're there with them monthly to coach them on how to use the data, how to connect it to purpose, and then if they have a question after that, we're able to then go in and say, okay, great, we're going to help you problem solve this particular challenge. So they have a lot of hands-on support from us in terms of carrying out this process. So I would not say that they are, ready to go and do this on their own. They're doing it alongside two coaches, me and my colleague.
So how many coaches does the Reed Charlotte team have in this data improvement, in the continuous improvement process? Two. Okay, and how many partners are you working with?
10 organizations, 28 leaders.
10 organizations, 20 leaders. Would you say that you have tons of extra time to spare and you're kind of bored?
No, not at all.
No, you would not. So would you say that that's about the right amount that you would need, or is that could one person do 5 orgs or 5 collaboratives? Like, how much capacity is needed?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the needs of the organization, and so in order to keep it as flexible as possible for those organizations to get the deep support they need, I think 2 to 10 organizations is probably sufficient.
Got it.
And more than that could potentially compromise quality of the coaching and training.
Okay, so I'm going to move to Bill, but I just want to, an editorial comment, is that when you go to corporations that are considered to be the absolute best in the world, at being the best at getting better, if you will, right? Figuring out how to improve their work, they have coaches like this, right? This is a function that exists in order to get to excellent. And there's even business books that would say people like you that work with, within corporations to improve products, they do better, right? They make more profit. So the question would be, how comfortable can we get as a society to say in the social sector, this capacity is actually useful, right? Even if you're not spending the money on programming, you may get more bang for your buck by having these data experts that are constantly improving. So there you go. All right, there's my editorial comment. I feel better. I don't know if you all do or not, but that's a big thing in my mind. All right, Bill, you're up. Good.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be quick and first of all, reintroduce myself. So I am with United Way of Salt Lake. It's probably best that you don't think of me or United Way of Salt Lake as a funder of this work, which we do, but that you think of us as partnership builders. We build partnerships with schools in a network of place-based communities and are part of a regional effort that is a Strive Together partner. So that's where this work comes from, and I've got to give credit to Jeff, to the team at Strive Together, and to Amy Ahrens-Terpstra, who's on our staff and leads much of the work that I'm describing. I want to share 3 quick examples of the work that we're doing embedded within not only a campaign for grade level reading, but the 3rd grade reading work is part of our overall effort to change outcomes at scale for kids from school readiness to post-secondary education. I also maybe want to say that I sat through the presentation before, and I had this deja vu moment about learning about continuous improvement. And I remember hearing about it, going, oh, that makes total sense. I get that. Of course I want to improve. Of course my organization is a learning organization. We're doing this already. And it might have been Jeff, it might have been 10 other people said, no, we're not doing it. Like, this is a real science. Like, it's a real skill. And to get to one of the questions about what's the biggest challenge of embedding this internally, it's understanding what it is and making it the work, to not cheat and think, oh, well, we debriefed a meeting and we learned, so we're a continuous improvement organization. There's a science behind this, and we're learning about this from Strive Together, from partners that we have in our community. It's a process, and it's rigorous.
If I could just say, the exact moment that Bill realized that they weren't actually doing continuous improvement was the moment when he still had hair.
That's right. That's right.
So this is it's almost a traumatizing moment, I think.
It was about a year ago.
Yeah, it was about a year ago. That's right. It was, but it is a traumatizing moment to be like, wait a minute, there is something deeper you have to do, more intentional. So.
Yep. So 3 quick examples that highlight lessons that we've learned about this. The speaker earlier talked about setting a good, smart target, or AIM. This is what Amy and her team are working on with a network in our community focused on improving age-appropriate development for 0 to 3-year-olds. And they've started by thinking about what's the whole population that we share accountability for, and they've worked their way down to a population of 1,200 0 to 3-year-olds in Title I schools in a specific zip code in a specific school district. And then they've set an aim, which is to improve the percentage of kids who are outside of the below or monitoring zone for, on a test called the ASQ from 40% to 30% by June 2019. That's their goal. That's the specificity. One of the early lessons I was offered when I first heard this that I rejected, again, stupidly, was specificity is your friend. And I remember thinking to myself, specificity is not even an acquaintance to me, and probably would be an enemy. Like, I really am a generalist kind of person, and it's really taken a lot of soul searching to become committed to specificity, committed to the rigor around this. This is the partially annotated run chart that Jeff mentioned a second ago, which helped us understand that you can't do continuous improvement with high-stakes testing data once a year. You really need to get data in the shortest cycle you can so that you can do what we've learned about today. So you can test an intervention, understand understand the problem, and I learned a ton in that presentation about understanding the problem before you even get to the continuous improvement process. This is a great example of a network that we were supported in by Strive Together. So to answer another question about how you make this part of your work, we asked for and embraced help from others, and we took their expertise and we formed this group of people that were working on chronic absence together, cohorts of teams from various parts of our partnership. And this is from one particular school, James Moss Elementary. And this is data from a year ago. I couldn't find the slide that's from the last 4 months, but it's awesome. So you can see that when they started to do this specific work, they started to reduce the chronic absenteeism rate in the school. If I could have found the chart for the last 4 months, what it would show you is they got even more specific. They looked into this data and realized that it was kids with IEPs who were missing the most school. So they narrowed their population even further to focus on kids with IEPs. They figured out what interventions were currently going on. They got really focused on a mentoring program that was happening in the school but wasn't very effective. They tested some changes in that. They further reduced the chronic absenteeism for those kids with IEPs and simultaneously watched benchmark scores in reading and math increase for those kids and for the school. It's very, very cool. The last thing that I'll add before wrapping up is just that we're so committed to this, we're now applying it to our own functions, not just the work that happens in our community, which is powerful and important and critical. But if we aren't good at understanding what our contribution to the result is, we can't improve on it. So we're now collecting data on our own performance measures as backbone staff. And once we've collected enough data on our own performance measures, we will begin doing continuous improvement work on our own efforts with our partners. All of that, I guess, leads me to the last thing, that as passionate as we are about this, we've noticed a little bit of a challenge that some people will get so focused on the micro data that they might forget that there is still a population level result that we are working towards, and that's the big idea, that we can't probably move those needles without better rigor around continuous improvement. But if we end up forgetting that those big needles are out there and solely focusing on strategy and program performance in continuous improvement cycles, then I think we're going to slow our work down. We won't get to scale fast enough.
Great. Pretty good. That was good stuff. Come on, guys, let's go. Bring it. Bring some energy. Good. He went longer, so you still get the award for going shortest. So that was great. One quick question, though. Getting to one of the questions that we heard from the audience at the beginning is, how did you manage the resistance internally to this type of work, especially when you shifted to not just looking at how partners are using data, but how you internally are using data? My guess is there was some resistance because it feels probably burdensome to use data in that way. So how have you worked through that, and any secrets that you've learned to embed it in your organization?
So I think we're still working through some of that. I don't think it's perfectly embraced by everybody, but we hired a continuous improvement coach, a trainer on our staff, whose job is to help us build momentum, practice, and just rally us all around every continuous improvement effort in the organization.
Wow, so you have a full-time, like Deepti is working with partners. You have somebody in your organization that's working internally and maybe with partners as well, but definitely has an internal focus.
Yep.
Is that right?
75% internal. Yep.
75% internal. Awesome. All right, good. Okay, last person, Tafona.
Great. Well, good afternoon. As mentioned, I'm Tafona Ervin. I serve as the Executive Director with the Foundation for Tacoma Students, and we support the Graduate Tacoma movement. I think it's important to give a little bit of historical context. Graduate Tacoma is a community-wide movement that is supporting a cradle-to-career collective impact outcome, very similar to what you heard from Bill. We are part of the Strive Together network, and we came on board with Strive Together right around the time that we came on board with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Our community identified 17, if you can imagine, student and community indicators that it said it was going to focus on over the next 10 years and begin to make measurable progress on. And frankly, in 2010, when we set those ambitious goals, we were not sure we were going to hit even one, let alone 17 of them. But the community has rallied, and the community has worked significantly to make some improvements, not knowing then that we were using continuous improvement or improvement science, but knowing that we had to do something that was going to change the culture and the way in which our community was actually engaging with both its community, its students, and then with its school district as well. And since then, we've began to really go deeper. And I start with the slide, and I will be honest, I thought I was going to go the shortest, but now, as I've heard from these two, I might go a little bit longer than they did. I start with this slide, not intended for you to read it, more for you just to kind of see a visual that can be found on our website. But we set this bold, ambitious goal that by 2020, we would improve the graduation goals. We set this goal because it was, frankly, the worst indicator for our community, where half of our students were graduating on time each and every year. In fact, you probably heard the story before, but we were featured in USA Today as a dropout factory in our country. So, we're already the stepchild to Seattle. Now we're on the USA Today newspaper saying that we're a dropout factory. Our community felt as though it needed to do something different. And so it doubled down. It figured different ways to engage with both the school district as well as the local, regional, and state policymakers and figure out what interventions we needed to do differently. To the question about how do you know if one intervention is actually impacting the outcome, we like to say, at least I do, we don't, because there are so many variables that impact even one intervention. However, as we continue to look at the interventions that we've put funding and resources behind, we can make some generalizations that there's some merit to doing that particular work, whether that's change in instruction, additional tutoring and coaching time, if that's offering more out-of-school time credits for students to reach graduation, et cetera. We found that all of these individualized intervention rolled up to the aggregate to get us to where we are today. So we moved from 55% graduation rate in 2010 to 86% four-year on-time graduation rate this last year. Thank you. And to the question that someone posed about how do you give credit, 100% that credit goes to no one but everyone, right? No one person made that happen, no one teacher, no one district, no one school member, but rather community members, parents, students themselves, and all of the players who are actively working on this work. I can go on and on about how many different cycles of and processes we went through to say who's doing what at which level, who are you serving, where's the overlap, are we missing students? But But yet what we try to do is we bring all of these partners in by way of each of our networks, and we give them the credit because they're the ones who come up with the ideas, who are meeting regularly, who are lifting the challenges, many of whom are working directly with families and students who understand those environmental factors that are impacting student improvement. And we lift all of that up and we roll that into what we believe are some suggested interventions that we then put out there and we say, what are we going to do next?
If I could just interrupt real quick, just to further expand on that, I went to one of their annual report card where they shared this data. They had all the partners in the room, and what was noticeable to me was the logos of almost every single partner were on the walls. Yeah. So it was physically, it wasn't just Graduate Tacoma up there. You physically in the room saw the logos of the partners and some of the impact that they had. And I think it made people feel more invested because during the event, you could point and be like, hey, when they did that, it was awesome. Or when they did that, and they were pointing to the logos. So it was a way to share credit, not only focus on the effort. Anyway, I just want to give you kudos for that because I thought it was pretty powerful.
And yet we're honoring this year partnerships because we feel like we're not doing enough, so I appreciate that. As it relates to the context of this convening and while we're here today, I want to talk a little bit about one intervention that the Early Learning and Reading Network came up with. So in our community, and much like your own, our reading rates have hovered around 50% or less for years, and it continues to be the story of our community. And while we looked at generalizing, how do we do some supports, more access to books perhaps, or more instructional tutoring and such, what we learned was we really weren't naming and targeting and getting to the root causes of why these numbers were consistently low for our students. And so we had this aha moment. In fact, it was a community member who really surfaced it. I have to really note and underscore Bill's statement, unless you're going to really name the inequities within education and until you're going to be explicit about what it is that you're trying to impact, you're really not going to make the measurable progress that you want. You have to call out that Black and Hispanic or Pacific Islander and Native American, or that the east side of your community, the area code of 98405, continues to see these disparities. And until you can name it, people can't really conceptualize what it is you're talking about. They generalize for our district 30,000, and they say, well, what are we going to do for 30,000? Well, we're probably not going to do a lot for 30,000 today, but there are about 10 students right across the street who, if we were intentional with, we might get a little bit better results from. And so what you see in this particular graph, if you can see it, is baseline data from our new standardization in Washington that took place in 2014 to now. We haven't made very many gains. However, if you notice the disaggregated data box at the very bottom, Pacific Islander and Black students continue to surface as the lowest achieving demographic group in our community. And more so, they continue to have the biggest academic slide as we look at summer slide going into the academic year the next year. And so as our network was grappling with some of that information and as they were thinking about that, they were saying, well, what can we do? How do we name one group? How do we go deeper? And an intervention arose, which was the most impactful for Black students in our community are their local barbers because they see them regularly. Many of our Black students don't have active fathers in their life, and if they have a mother, they're usually doing multiple things to maintain a household and can't really focus on the instruction of reading and or lifting them with opportunities to engage in out-of-school summer learning opportunities. And so we convened a group of barbers. There were about 17 barbershops, Black barbershops in Tacoma, all of which had anywhere from 2 to 5 barbers, and they all came together. We ordered from a local Black-owned breakfast shop with fried chicken and waffles, and we had a really sweet tea, and everyone was really excited. And while that seems a little culturally like, oh, are you sure you want to do that? It was appreciated. And these barbers came in, they let their hair down, some of them who did not have it, and they gave us the most, no pun intended for Bill, but they gave us the most authentic voices that we could have ever have received about what it means for them to engage. And frankly, some of the sentiments that were shared was, why are you telling me to worry about reading? Why should I care about these kids reading on grade level? Or why should I care that the school system wants them to meet this standard that doesn't really apply to my life? Some of them were saying, you know, it's not really important to meet your standards, but our own standards. And if I measure success in this way, who are you to tell us differently? Many of them who have kids in the district. And what we had to do is we had to change the narrative. You all know this, but we come into these settings, we are experts, we get really great promising practices, we share them with our constituents, and we say, we believe this might be the best way for you to approach it. And really what we're saying is we're telling you what to do, and you're not really giving us a way to tell you how we should do this. And so what we did immediately, and this is part of that Plan, Study, Do, Act, is we immediately changed our narrative, and we said, well, help us understand what you might think would be a best way for us to engage reading opportunities. And we began to collect some of that information. So if you were in the previous session, you saw that Plan, Study, Do, Act, or a segment of action research that talks about how you iterate your process. How do you look at what it is you're doing? And what we found was that we had to think differently. We had to say to a family, if you value athletics and you want your kid to get a contract, they may need to read that contract to know that they either are going to be taken advantage of or they're going to make money for you at the end of the day. And for them, a spark went off. Parents' eyes lit up. Kids are like, yes, I want to read. And now they're talking about why you want to comprehend language and why you need to make inferences and all of those other things that are part of the standardization. But it's not the common way that we see it today when we're talking about instruction or reading. And I can go on a little bit, and I apologize I do not have it listed in such a way that shares with you, but I'm always happy to talk about how we're using the authentic feedback of our community to actually inform our practice. And what we're hoping to do, to one of the questions around access to books, we began this work with our barbershops 2-3 years ago with just giving them books. And we've been every year committing to giving them books. And it wasn't until this last year that we actually engaged them and realized that while we were giving them books, they didn't really know what to do with them. They just had them in their barbershop. They didn't really know if they should keep them, tell them they can't take them, if they should read them while they're getting haircuts, etc. And so that's been part of our process, and we're starting to improve that a little bit. And our hope is that this next year we'll be able to monitor how many books were received, how many kids were visiting that shop, how many kids actually read those books, and whether or not there was some interaction, self-reported, from the kiddos themselves who were being seen. And that's a little bit more into that Plan, Study, Do, Act iteration that we're following in Tacoma.
Outstanding. All right, what do you think? Good.
Thank you.
All right. I can't say how many times when I was working with the network in Cincinnati and then working with networks, people would get all the way up to that point of we gave them the books and then just walk away, right? Or stop paying attention. They're like, we did our job, we got them the books, it'll be great. So the fact that you're now taking the time to monitor who's reading them, how are they using them, so forth, it'll be fascinating to see what emerges from that. Yeah. All right, so we are going to open it up. I've already got to ask some questions, so I want to open it up to you all. I think the panelists got to most of the questions that were asked, but if we didn't, they'll know, and we'll get to that. You can name that. What other questions do you all have for these three folks that are doing the work on the ground in communities, just like many of you? Yes. Can you stand up and? What's that? So let me just repeat the self-reported student data in barbershops. Like, how does that work? Probably gets a little bit to this question of how do we know what intervention actually led to impact? If it's self-reported data, can you trust it?
Sure. So this year we had one of the kiddos of one of the barbershops come in and tell his own story about reading. And what he said was, I don't really like to read, but my teacher makes me read anyway. And I'm reading only for my contract because I know I'm going to be a pro football player, right? And so, we're all excited about that. And then when we asked him about his favorite books, what he resonated with, which was an aha for us, was culture-related books. So when we put books in front of him, he chose a book with a black boy on the front of that cover. He talked about what that meant to him, and we use that as intel. And of course, we know or should know that culture-related books and literature is helpful for students, but we didn't know to the degree. We have both Superman and Avengers, and then this one that had one black boy on it that says, I can be something. And he chose that one, and he felt inspired by that. Our goal is that the barbershops themselves will do a little bit of a self-survey, 3 questions max, and they will say, you know, with picture infographics is what we're thinking of. Tell us how you feel about reading after you've been here. Do you like to read more when you're here? Do you like to read more when you're at home? What does that look like for you? That'll give us a sense of how kiddos are feeling about just the concept of doing this as an opportunity. And then I wanted to just circle back to one of the biggest challenges for us that's been integrating this work is we only started with a dedicated data manager a year and a half ago. So I'm just in awe when I hear about this data group and convening who's meeting regularly and doing continuous improvement, because to be able to surface data and analyze it, talk about it, interpret it, visualize it is a very complex process for organizations to take on. And that's been a big challenge. But once you dedicate the staff to actually doing that work, it's amazing how far you'll go in a year and a half, and you can get great visualizations that you just saw, at least from our side.
So you have one dedicated person at Graduate Tacoma that
One.
works with partners.
Well, he works with just us, and our hope is that we will get more data folks to work with our partners so we can do more of this great work.
Great.
Wink, wink.
Yeah. Really? All right. Good. Other questions? Yeah, back here.
Oh, hi, you.
Hello? Okay. Better. One of the things we've been doing over the last 2 years is actually providing early literacy workshops to barbers. And a lot of the kind of work that we're doing is around cultivating children's reading identities. And we haven't yet had the kind of partnerships with universities to be able to create some of the evaluative tools that will look at things like reading self-concept, or implicit attitudes toward reading, which I think really get at some of the things that we're actually trying to move and that are often not included in a lot of the more traditional reading assessments, but that are key to whether or not a child decides to pick up a book when it's not required. And so I would love to hear from any of you guys if there's been any space in any of the work that you're doing to look at implicit attitudes toward reading or reading self-concept. And if not, that's cool too. But yeah, if you have, I'd love to hear about it.
First off, did you guys know each other?
No, it's so funny because we said we wanted to find Ervin and have him come
Right
to
here.
Tacoma and actually do a workshop with our barbers. So please don't go after this because I want to find you.
That is awesome. Ron, I think this whole
Thank you.
thing was a success.
Success.
It's a success. You should just drop the mic right now. Just do it. It's
Right
awesome.
there.
Good. All right. Any response to that question? Sorry, it took us off. Anybody?
We haven't done anything specifically. Yeah, sorry, no.
No.
I wish we had.
Same.
Yeah, and other than the self-reports that we just talked about, we haven't, but I think it's an area that we would like to go deeper on to figure out how we might do that more.
Has anybody in the room done that well? Yeah. Oh, Jenny. Great.
Hi, Alvin.
Yeah.
So I'm Jenny Bagoni from Read by Fourth, and one of our partners here in Philadelphia is doing some beginning stages of that, so let's also talk afterwards.
Yeah, it's definitely an area I feel like that's growing as people have started to get comfortable sort of with academic data. There's an openness to being comfortable to other types of data, I hope, right? And so if anybody does have examples of that, please do let us know. Other questions? Other back in the corner. By the way, this side of the room is getting crushed right now by this side of the room. I'm just putting it out there. I'm not saying it's bad or you're bad or anything like that.
We got one over there.
Oh, there's a question over here. Oh, okay, got it. Wait, you're next. Okay, you're next. Good. Okay.
Hi, I'm Kim Ship from Oakland Housing Authority. I wanted to ask the question of the gentleman from Salt Lake City. When you talked about setting smart targets and you mentioned that you were focusing on the 0 to 3-year-olds in Title I schools, I know that 0 to 3-year-olds don't go to school yet. A few of them may go to Head Start. So how did you get that data? Was it freely given to you? Did you go to hospitals? Are you talking to parents? I just want to know how were you able to obtain that particular data?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thankfully Amy is here in the room. We're using Census Bureau data, she said, and using the boundaries of those elementary schools, not the actual enrollment of the schools.
It does raise an interesting point. I don't know if either of you have started working with housing authorities to get data in different ways. We're seeing more people work with Health and Human Services departments to get data in different ways. Are either of you doing that, working with others?
We are working closely with Housing Authority, and it focuses more on attendance than it does on reading, but we are getting some data to kind of help add context to this.
Yeah, yeah.
We have an agreement with the school district to receive some data, and that helps us know broadly what might be happening in schools. But for the data collaborative, all of the data that's used is data that the organizations are collecting, so we have access to it.
Great.
And I would add, at least in Tacoma community, we have a statewide child care resource, or Child Care Aware, who does data collection around quality child care providers. And while they give snapshot data, it has been helpful to be able to see where some of those 0 to 3-year-olds are actually attending a preschool or a program, so we can be able to better use that as a pilot. And we do that in some of our early kindergarten awareness work, but it's a little hard to use.
One of the cool things about continuous improvement science is they have like 1,000 mantras. It's a mantra heavy. Or anybody here into Buddhism and all that? You know, so if you get into continuous improvement, you get mantras like crazy. And one of the mantras is start with the data you have. Start with the data you have, because people can get so distracted by seeking data that they forget to do the work and they forget the ultimate outcome, as Bill talked about. So anyway, that's just a little nugget. But you can find creative ways to get that data. That's what I've learned. Yeah, over here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Hetty Chang.
You're doing great.
Thanks. I was wondering, even though you just started with the conversation, start with the data you have, and Bill, I'm wondering in particular whether you all have been able to do this in Salt Lake City, which is, it's the issue of looking at cumulative impacts and the interaction between impacts. So the theory around our issues around chronic absence is if we reduce chronic absence, you're going to create more learning time, quality learning time. It's going to result in kids learning more, and you also have a theory that if you can reduce chronic absence, let's say in pre-K, that you're going to actually have better attendance in K. And my question is whether any of you have been able to look at both cumulative impacts over time and interrelated impacts across outcome areas.
So I don't think we've done the study that answers that question really well, but I think we've created the environment where we can do that. We've been building our data sharing agreements and our trust with our partners and getting better at just the mental rigor of thinking like this. So I think we have the ability to do it, but we haven't done it yet.
We do not yet. This is our first year.
Boy, we do a number of things around attendance. So Tacoma has been known as probably the worst school district in Washington State for attendance. Some of that could be based on how it's being calculated. Some of that is based on standards and for the state. What we noticed, a couple things, is for elementary school, and we piloted this, was nudge letters, and we used data to say, okay, we noticed that in this elementary school on the east side, which is our most impoverished community, at this particular elementary school, kids are just not attending. And so then we sent these letters and we did a comparison, your kid compared to the average kid, the impact of educational outcomes, particularly for third grade reading and high school graduation. And we began to see improvements initially. So that happens with that week by week when we send that out. But then the trends go back down to where they were. And so what we're now trying to figure out is how do we get beyond the week by week influx and actually keep a more sustainable engagement with that. But then our community, we have an 85% or higher healthy attendance goal. High school is where we really have most of the problems. Our elementary school students are doing a lot better than high school, but we just have a lot more work to do.
Can I just make one comment? Because the nudge letter thing, it's a good tier 1 intervention. It's
Right.
not sufficient.
Right.
It can move to work. And our challenge is we don't look at also the question of what works for whom. And
Right.
if you have actually a kid who's more chronically absent or more severely, they're going to need multiple interventions. You
Right.
actually have to have 3 or 4.
Right.
Nudge letter can be only one piece, but we haven't been good at looking at cumulative impact across interventions. And then when it doesn't work because it's not sufficient given the need of the kid, we think it doesn't work. That's one of, I think, our challenges in the field.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that, I mean, not to shamelessly plug annotated run charts or anything, but if you do a run chart like that and you do one intervention and you see it went up, if you stop and be like, oh, okay, we won, And don't look at the next week when it starts to go down, and then the next week and it starts to go down, and you make the assumption that you've won with the nudge letter, right? And you win, and you're done, and then you really weren't. So that's the benefit of sort of staying vigilant and constantly monitoring. And I think that's really powerful that you're all doing that. Others?
Hello, my name is Jada Best, and I am here from Erie County. And I have a question in regards to data sharing agreements. And how do you go about getting those so that you have access to the data that you need? And for example, where we are, our school district uses Infinite Campus. However, our preschool uses a program called Pelican, which is through the state that tracks attendance. So how do you get permission to have different data entities give you data that's shared so that it's usable?
I would say it's relationships. So I think the ways in which we've been able to get those data sharing agreements, it took a lot of work behind the scenes before I even arrived at Reach Charlotte to build relationships with those folks in the district, to help them understand why you want the data, how you're going to use it. And then eventually over time, as you've built that relationship, I think there's probably a point in time where you will feel comfortable making the ask. And then hopefully there's someone who can help you with the legal documents. There's also a lot of documents online in terms of putting a data sharing agreement together.
I wouldn't differ from that at all, but I had the thought recently that I wished we had maybe done a better job early on. We built relationships with school districts and partners and did exactly that. And I wished recently that we had done a better job of convincing the partners that they weren't sharing data with us. I wish I had done we had done a better job creating this sense of shared accountability for the population that they serve, so that we didn't have to convince them to share data with us. It's their data, they collect it every day, but we first convinced them to share it. And then we had to convince them to be accountable with us for that data. And I think if we had flipped that, we'd be further along.
The only thing I would add to that is, I think lawyers really complicate things. They make it a little bit more crazier. If there's any lawyers in the house, I apologize. Because honestly, the law makes it very clear that if you're using it for educational purposes and outcomes, like, you should be able to have access to it. And it goes back to those relationships. And so long as you can clearly point that you're doing this particular intervention to support the outcomes of this students, that is for the students of data that they have, whether it's a district or community partner, that there is some tie and there's some leniency there, but it's really difficult to state that case. So it starts with that relationship first and then allow them to kind of get there from there.
Yeah, it also, just to piggyback a little bit on your point, Deepti, about convincing people how you're going to use it. So then right away proving how you're going to use it once you get that agreement, so that they actually see that you're not going to use it as like a gotcha tool, but as a tool to help support their work. That was just another additional insight. Yeah, anybody over here? Yeah, right there.
Hi, Nyla Bolis with Jumpstart. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit in more detail about the short cycle data collection. So like, what are you looking at? How are you making decisions about who to look at? And then in particular, what are you doing in response? Like, so maybe give us an example of sort of how the whole cycle worked in the short cycle.
Sure. Unfortunately, it doesn't pertain to the early grades, but I can give one around FAFSA because it's our most easiest one that we've used. So on FAFSA completion, we want to increase the number of students, particularly who would be eligible to complete the federal application for free student aid each year. And we've hovered for a while around the 58th percentile of students who are completing that, knowing that we have about a 62% population who are impacted by poverty, of which about, I wouldn't say, only 50% of those students were the ones who are eligible. Much more granular than you need to know. What we found was that as we were doing an intervention, particularly at 5 comprehensive high schools, and we were looking at the basic application nights, we would say, did this have an impact on that day? Who actually attended? So demographically, was it Black, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, Native American, who was our biggest gap that was missing? How did we pair that back to the student enrollment of the low impacted students that we know needed to be there? And then how did we intentionally call down to do more in-depth interventions to get them to kind of come out and do that work? When we did that particular work to get more students who were eligible, we did another layer of, okay, now what's next? How do we continue to push the parent signature and what intervention needed to happen? And it's looking at every point and then almost disaggregating each one of those subsets to say, if it's not just a population, so boys were not coming out as much as girls, we would do something for boys, or if it was blacks were just not showing up as much as Hispanics, we were doing something for them. And particularly with Hispanics, we have a dream or a state act for students to receive aid, but they didn't know that information and it wasn't communicated to their families, and we didn't get that in our basic general information, so we had to think differently immediately to get more Hispanic families to come out and actually do that. And so it takes someone actually asking the questions, which I go back to this example of depending on who's at the table, you may not know culturally how to ask the right questions because you may not understand the barriers that might exist, right? So you may not be impacted by whether or not you can fill out a FAFSA or a WASFA or whatever it's called, and so you wouldn't know to say, make sure you do it in this language or in this different way. What we just recently learned is that there are like 21 dialects of Spanish in our own community, and we were doing it in one, and we were assuming that that one was enough to generalize, and what we learned was it wasn't, and even with the different dialects, some families didn't understand it properly, and so it really just takes asking the questions and asking, I think we call it the 5 whys, like, why is this happening? Why do we keep doing the same things? Why are we, why? And we eventually got to a place where we're starting to get more to the root causes of why perhaps it's happening, so.
So one of the things we've noticed is that it's easier to look for data that schools collect that's not short cycle. But schools have lots of short cycle data. Teachers are doing formative assessments all the time, and sometimes it's just about asking the right questions and having enough trust for people to say, oh, well, yeah, of course we do that. Let's talk about that, and let's see what we can experiment with. Sometimes internally to our organizations, we've realized we've just had to collect data for certain things that we've done to practice continuous improvement. For example, we did an organizational continuous improvement project to stop ineffective meetings. But we did it as a continuous improvement project. So we collected baseline data, we spent some time understanding the problem, and then we tested some interventions, and then we would survey people with 2 questions or 2 or 3 questions, you know, at the end of each week, and we figured out what we were doing to have ineffective meetings, and we were able to mostly stop it. We were able to improve.
Great, so we're going to go ahead and extend this session an hour and a half to delve into that, Bill. It's going to be great. Good use of time. Monroe, did you have something? Yep.
I do, actually. It builds on Bill's question. So, Deepti, I've heard that you use Net Promoter Scores as an internal short cycle continuous improvement tool, so I wonder if you could talk about that.
Sure. So we believe in refining our approach continuously. So the training we provide, the coaching we provide, we often ask folks how that was to get a sense of the quality of the training and coaching. So after each training session, we ask folks to rate us using the Net Promoter Score, which tells you, if you're not familiar with it, gives you a sense of whether or not they would come back and buy your product again. So we see each training as an experience that we're providing for the trainees. And if that experience is 8, 9, or 10, or a 9 or 10, we know that they're definitely gonna recommend us. And so we wanna get more scores that are 9 or 10. So what we do after each training is we take both the quantitative, their score, and then the qualitative is actually more important. It tells us why they rated us that way. And then before planning that next training, we put together all of the data and make adjustments. And when we come back to that next session, we say, we heard you say that you really liked this during the session, but you didn't really like this. Here's how we've adjusted this particular training session for that purpose. That's helped us get better faster in a year that was a very steep learning curve, where we were able to rely on that over and over again to understand how we could improve on our own processes of the data collaborative.
It's a little bit of a theme that's emerging of you got to practice what you preach, right? And so when I was at Strive Together, Annie, Casey had some coaches working with us, and they called us out. They said, you guys are out preaching continuous improvement. We don't see you doing any of that inside your own organization. So we took a year to embed it before going back out and trying to coach in it. that was really important. Not saying that the organization does it perfectly now, but at least it forces you to realize what you're asking people to go through and the struggles that it entails. We have time for one more question. Any last questions? Yeah. Okay, right up here. Yep.
Oh.
So what part of the process involves parent engagement, just so everybody could hear it? Yeah.
So I'm currently working on a dissertation on parent and family engagement, so I could probably speak for another hour and a half myself. So our community probably 3 years ago, actually with the help of Strive Together, elevated and lifted that parents and families needed to be voiced in our process, and that we needed to understand from them some of their barriers and their challenges with the district. And that has led to a rabbit hole of different things, right? And so what we have found was that we needed to begin more intentional. We have 4 collaborative action networks for our Cradle to Career work, and each one of them have a focus on parent and family engagement by way of either doing events specifically for families, focus groups, or fishbowl activities, by way of having them do surveys. Recently, we established a parent advisory council who is impacting the way in which we are influencing district policies, the way in which we are thinking about funding, the way in which we're doing events and outreach. And this particular council is separate from Tacoma Public Schools because we did not want it to be limited to what they wanted or how they wanted to filter their work through, but rather that it was authentically engaged from the families, very diverse in gender as well as race, ethnicity, and we use that as part of our lever to say, are the interventions and the actions that we're taking really comparable to what parents and families are asking for? And frankly, not all of them are. But what we're finding is that we're getting a little bit more intentional with that work, and we're able to really lift that. We're going through a strategic refresh right now as an backbone organization, and lifting dedicated resources, time-bound commitments to this work is what we decided is necessary if we're really going to be intentional lifting this. But we've only aimed it and used as an a la carte type of process, as many of our districts and partners have, and so we're getting a little bit more intentional in that area.
Anything you'd want to add?
We were able to support the groups to share data with families when it was appropriate, to share where their child's progress was currently and what they could be doing at home to support that even further.
And I would just add, if Amy will raise her hand at the back, we're building a parent engagement strategy that's pretty robust into that 0 to 3 impact and improvement project. So there'll be lots of improvement science going on around parent engagement, and you could connect with her to learn more about that.
So I'll just finish before thanking our panelists with 2 quick stories. One that gets directly at what you're talking about. There was an example in San Antonio where they were working on attendance, and the business community was about to do a big billboard campaign because attendance was going down, and the assumption of the business community was if we put up a bunch of billboards, more kids are going to go to school, right? I mean, it makes total sense. And right before they paid for that, somebody asked a group of parents, do you have an idea why all of a sudden attendance is so bad? And they said, absolutely. If you look at the kids that are not attending, they're the ones that are going to live closest to the school because you made it so the kid had to leave a full mile from the school to get a bus, not just half a mile, right, to get the city bus pass or a bus. And they looked at it, and in fact, the kids that weren't attending school lived right next to it. They just didn't, feel comfortable or whatever it was. So they shrunk back down the bus lines, and lo and behold, attendance went up, right? Saving millions and millions of dollars from that intervention. So the key points in continuous improvement to engage parents, it's all along the process, but definitely in trying to figure out what the problem really is up front, and then understanding the impact of interventions. And then the other story I wanted to tell is from Phoenix, actually. There was a network working on early grade reading, and they couldn't find anybody that was willing to share data on their intervention, their actual intervention. They really were struggling. And this one principal held up her hand and said, all right, we've got the best intervention in the world. If you just want to come and learn about how to do it, just come and observe our school. And so they sent in the Deepti of the world, and they observed, and they did all these over a course of 2 weeks, I think. And it was an initiative where they pulled kids out and did extra support with them through a local nonprofit. And when they looked at the benchmark assessments, because I think you're right, a lot of schools are keeping that, it turned out that those kids were actually doing worse over time, right? And the principal at first was like, oh my God, this is going to be so deflating to the teachers. We can't possibly share this data. she finally said, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to share it with the teachers. And she was all worried. They pulled the early grade reading teachers together. They looked at the data, and the principal was so nervous. And the teachers were like, well, of course, we knew this was the dumbest intervention in the world, but you made us do it. Right? She said, of course. They knew. So the person that was nervous was the person who had decided that was the intervention, not the people that were delivering it. And I think a lot of times we're scared to share data with people because we ourselves are worried about how we'll look or how we'll feel, not really about the ultimate outcome, that trend line that we want to improve, right? We're just worried about sort of protecting a reality that really doesn't exist. And so having the courage to share the data and analyze it, often people are very open to it. Now, there are times when it's a nightmare, right? It is deflating, and it makes people, then you have cake, right? I think it was important to have cake, right? You get lots of cake. I think Sharon said, no more pizza, so let's go with cake, because that's much better. But the bottom line is it's possible, right? And you can have the courage to share that data, and it really can make a big difference, especially when you're doing what all three of you are, which is looking at it consistently over time, making sure we're not making assumptions that one intervention, maybe it's a cluster of them, are having, like, you're doing that work. So first, congratulations, thank you. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you all very much.
Hang on one second. Well, I just want to say just how incredible that panel was. Let's join me in thanking them again. So one measure of how great the panel was how much you participated in that. And I think about the fact that I actually got an exercise routine in. I wasn't able to jog today, but moving around the room with the microphone with so many questions from all of you gave me my exercise for today. So thank you for that. Jeff, thank you for moderating. What a fantastic job Jeff did moderating that panel. And I think you heard about 3 great community examples who have really taken up this challenge of impact and improvement that we've been talking about, are taking it seriously. So please join me in thanking again Charlotte, Tacoma, and Salt Lake City for doing such a great job. Okay, so we are going to take a 15-minute break, and we are going to be back in here promptly. Actually, more like a 10-minute break. Back in here promptly at 1:45 for the start of the next session. 1:45. Thank you.